Welcome. Good to see many of you here today for our third webinar in a series on gardening and climate change. This one on native plants, trees, and ornamentals. My name is Maddie. I work at MOFGA and have been facilitating this series. And the folks you'll be hearing from today are Emily Baisden from Wild Seed Project, Maddie Eberly from MOFGA, and Erin Parker from Edgewood Nursery. A few quick housekeeping notes. We'll have some time for questions at the end. You can feel free if you want to keep track of your questions, if you don't want it to flee your mind. You can type that in the chat and I will make note of it and bring it up to our panelists later. And if you have any clarifying questions, like you need an immediate answer to make sense and follow the presentation, you can ask that in the chat as well, and I will pose that immediately. You should be able to follow along with the transcript. You should be able to find the button to do that by clicking in the Zoom bar below your screen. And this will be recorded and the recording will be shared out with you all, so you'll also be able to access it and refresh your memories that way. That is the end of my little spiel, and I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful presenter, Emily.
Hi there. Thanks so much. Yeah, glad to be here with you all. I'm Emily Baisden. I work with Wild Seed Project. For those who don't know us, we're a nonprofit that's focused on native plants and growing them from seed to build biodiversity. So I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Can everybody see that? Great. So we're going to talk about, gardening and climate change and how that affects native plants or how native plants can help us mitigate that. But I really want to start with talking about kind of the state of biodiversity of where we're at right now in 2025 and how that really parallels with climate change as we're seeing what's happening now and what we can kind of expect in the future to really exacerbate what's been happening with biodiversity loss. So I'm going to start off on a fairly depressing note, but I promise this will get more hopeful and exciting and give some tangible things that we can do to help mitigate what's going on in the world. So yeah, let's get started. So, the world is increasing with temperature, and that's really, really a parallel with what's happening with biodiversity loss. So what you're seeing here is on the top there, it's bars from it's the Living Planet Index. They use information from the World Wildlife Foundation and kind of make these graphs. And this is showing how our climate is warming on the top there as it gets red, and then how biodiversity has been lost at the bottom there, going green to gray. And that's just in the past 50 years or so. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about involves what's been happening in the past 50 years. And essentially, as the climate is warming, we are losing a lot of life. I want to note that biodiversity loss, the main causes of biodiversity loss currently are how we use our land and seas and waterways and things like that. It's really human driven, and only now is starting to be more connected with these shifts in climate and these storms and heat events. So in the past 50 years, this is a study on vertebrate speciation, and that they're showing declines of about 73% of vertebrates in the past 50 years. So that's not great. Birds, I talk a lot about birds and insects. My background's entomology and environmental science. So that's how I got into the world of native plants. But I'm a big birder too. And this study came out about 5 years ago that found that we've lost about 3 billion birds in the past 50 years. And that's 1 in 4 birds gone since 1970. And that's a vast amount of birds. And that is not because of climate change. That is because of the way that we tend to our land. And the State of the Birds report, both of those are from Cornell and the North American Bird Conservation Initiative. And this is this year's report, and they're seeing kind of the same trends. One positive is in places where a lot of money has been spent for conservation and building habitat, they do see increases in population. That tends to be with our ducks. Um, and then, of course, probably several of you have seen the tons of stories out right now about insect decline. I know the past few weeks, a lot have been focusing on this study that showed we're rapidly losing our butterflies. But insects and invertebrates in general are really, really, really great indicators of overall ecosystem health. And what we're seeing is massive losses in abundance and diversity. And the biodiversity changes are mostly, like I said, driven by land use, but they're going to be increasingly exacerbated by climate change, and they can use a lot more modeling with these types of species that have their life cycle is dependent on temperature days, so degree days and things like that. So we can get kind of a good idea of what's going to happen to the larger food chain on what we can expect to happen with bugs and invertebrates and things like that. So all that to say, climate change in the face of already extreme biodiversity loss can really exacerbate the pressures on both at-risk and common species. So I talked about the birds before. They're finding even species that have been quite common, even like starlings that aren't a native species, are seeing population declines. So it's not great. And with climate change, we can only expect these to be exacerbated. But that's really where native plants can come in, and the way that we tend to the lands that we do have control over can really cause some good change. So before I go any further on native plants, I always want to define them, because if you try to Google, what a native plant is, you'll regularly find all sorts of different opinions and different versions and views. So I like to talk about my view, at least, on what I consider a native plant. And that is a plant that's indigenous and occurs naturally in a particular region, ecoregion, habitat. And most importantly, I think that it's something that's co-evolved with the other living things in the area. So the flora, the fauna, fungi, microorganisms, things like that. Usually here, that means it's something that was here prior to European colonization. That brings me to some really important questions about who gets to decide what's native or what is naturally occurring, that we really don't want to forget and want to keep in all of our practices is first of all, humans have been moving plants around this continent and everywhere humans have been for as long as humans have been there, for millennia. And that's across ecosystems, through riverways, across various ecoregions. We've been moving plants. So, who gets to decide who gets to move plants and when, and what that timeline is. And then also, especially in somewhere like the Northeast, where we are so glacially dependent. The glaciers receded about like by 15,000 years ago. I don't think we had any glaciers anymore. And when the glaciers left, they took all of the any sort of plant matter that was in that soil with them. So that means this whole region was recolonized by plants at some point, and animals came with it. So even when you look at populations south of us, they have more species of plant, but a lot of the same plants as well. And that all has to do with how plants moved naturally, once again, in quotes. So I don't have an answer to that question, but I really think everybody that's working with native plants or plants in general should be thinking about both how is this plant going to affect the ecosystem, the living beings around me, and who got to put it where it is today and who gets to make the decisions about it. So that gets me into why are they so freaking important? Native plants provide all of these ecosystem services that, because of the way that we've managed a lot of our living lands, we now rely on infrastructure to do. But plants were doing this long before we built up really developed landscapes that removed these native plants. So they were providing erosion control and water absorption and cleaning our air. And what I focus on is how they can provide habitat, food, shelter, pollination, which is just food for bugs. Um, but they have this role and it's important and we can keep adding them. But what does that mean for climate in the face of climate change? Well, we can assume, it's all great that they have these ecosystem services and we can assume that likely there will be some changes in maybe not the ability, but the way that these native plants can provide their ecosystem services. So we can expect things like the phenology to change, the time of flowering, the time of fruiting, things like that. We don't know how that will impact, the bugs that time whenever they arrive. There's a specialist on this geranium picture, the third over, that times its immersion from the soil to when things like geraniums are blooming. If the geranium blooms earlier than the bee comes out, what does that mean for that species? We really don't know yet, but luckily, plants and things with short life cycles are pretty good at adapting to their outside conditions. Um, so we can expect to see these changes in phenology. We can see probably, an altered ability to survive with warmer climates. We live in a climate that's historically gets snow, so we don't know how that will impact, I'm in the seed world, how that's going to impact the ability for species that require a cold period for their seeds to germinate. If they're not getting a sufficient amount of cold, what's that going to mean for them? Um, we climate change will lead to sea level rise and things like that. And we're not really sure how that's going to affect things. What we do know, and we can take from modeling ideas, we can make some predictions and go from there. And one of the things that we can do is look at these kind of predictions where we know the planting zones have shifted. They keep changing them on us. Anybody who does planting knows they keep changing them on us. But not only that, with that, we can expect to see more homogenization. So right now, our state is really broken up into all these different ecoregions that have really specific habitats. We're trying to build all these really cool habitats, but we can really expect to see a lot more homogenization as the climate changes, because fewer things are going to be able to survive in a more extreme condition. And we can use that to form habitats, that information to form habitats that might actually help us further on. So, like I said, native plants, I care about them feeding animals and wildlife. But we can also think about planting a more diverse landscape with native plants that support food webs and are tolerant to things like drought, things like compaction, flooding, salt, all these things that are expected to really increase with a more climate extremes. We can plant native plants that are both going to support that biodiversity and fill those roles. So with that, we know diversity leads to ecosystem stability. That's time and time again, we find that the right type of diversity leads to the right type of a stable community. And what we want to think about is thinking about planting for multiple levels of diversity. So species diversity, genetic diversity, ecosystem diversity. And I'm going to tap into, oh, presentation go? Did I lose you guys?
We are still here.
There it is. Sorry. My presentation zipped away on me for a second. I'm using Google Slides and I don't usually use Google Slides, so sometimes it goes away. All right, let's talk about species-rich plantings. So multi-level species diversity, we really want to think about, or multi-level diversity, we want to break it down into species diversity, genetic diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And when we're talking species diversity, we're talking about having what it says, more species, which means more species with more traits, more adaptations, more opportunity for things to thrive. So a species-rich planting in the face of extreme conditions means you're going to have way more likely of something both surviving during, say, a drought. If you have a drought and you have species that are tolerant to that, those ones will do fine. And that will lead to having not just something that's good looking in your site, but something that also provides all of the food, cooling, all of that. So that gets me to genetic diversity, which is something that I could do an entire talk on, so I'll be quick on it instead. Planting locally adapted seed allows for really great diversity within those species. So seeds are incredibly important. They're the way that plants are able to reproduce with diversified genes. That means much more likelihood in resilience within species. We know that inbreeding is not good. It leads to bottleneck genes, which leads to really limited resistance to extreme temperatures, diseases, things like that. We've found there's like case after case of when genes are bottlenecked, there is a less stable habitat. And not only that, but we can use seeds that are ecotypic. So seeds that are from the area. They've evolved with the area that you're growing them in. And we can take that a step further and continue to grow those seeds into plants that then produce more seed that have been within the climate that we're seeing. And you're going to have much more likelihood of survivability, much more likelihood of individuals that can fill these roles in extreme periods. And if we're continually collecting those seeds and planting them back in the environment, we're going to have more likelihood of resilience. So lastly, just talking about building those that ecosystem diversity. So having variable habitats and within those habitats, having lots of species and lots of genetically diverse species. So we can think about those habitats on certain levels. So you can think about just your yard and what types of habitats could fit in your yard. My yard's funky. It's like dry, sandy in the front yard, and in the backyard, I'm pretty close to the Androscoggin River, and it's basically a red maple swamp. So it's pretty different. But you can do things like learn about what the area around you is or was and try to connect some of those habitats. So that's something that I've been working on. My front yard, across the street from me, I live in Brunswick, and there's historically was a lot of managed sandplain grasslands there. And part of the reason we're losing our sandplain grasslands is because of the loss of indigenous work to burn those areas and maintain them as grasslands and blueberry barrens. And that's, through development and colonization, we've lost a lot of these habitats, but there's still these satellite areas throughout town that have those habitats. And when I moved into my house and stopped mowing, I realized that my front yard had a lot of those plants that are in the conservation area across the street from me. And then I started managing that area for that habitat. In the case that, if the town decides to put a parking lot there, at least my little area will provide some sort of buffer. So we can think about building certain types of habitat that match your abiotic conditions in your yard and that match kind of the surrounding areas. We can build and plant for specific species. So you can think about having host plants. If you want to bring in certain types of birds, you can think about their what types of trees they like to nest in, what type of habitat. And with that, having these multi-layer plantings, like having a canopy, an understory, and a ground cover layer is super useful. A lot of species live within edge habitats that are going to have all of those layers. And then really just that all promotes thinking of humans as part of the ecosystem, right? We are an animal. We all benefit from the ecosystem, and to build these systems in partnership with our non-human neighbors will actually help things really thrive. And as you're building those, just thinking about how you're managing to support wildlife. This one's also its own big talk, but really providing food, water, and shelter, just like humans. If we can have food, water, and shelter, and that with animals or with habitat builds community, we can have thriving ecosystems, even in the face of potential climate extreme weather events and things like that. So like I said, promoting host plants, don't do your garden cleanups. I've gotten to the point of just leave your leaves. A lot of people are like, okay, it's 50 degrees. I can rake my leaves now, right? Just leave them. They're great. They're great for native plants. They insulate the roots. They're going to help. It's basically a living mulch. They help retain moisture, which is going to be great for these like long stretches without rain that we get. It provides so much habitat for things. And then of course, get rid of your lawns and don't use pesticides. If you're going to be planting native plants, there's no point in putting any sort of pesticide on them, organic or not. We want to see creatures feeding on our plants, right? There's only very few exceptions. And I think, we can talk about those further if we want. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Emily. Maddie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. So I will get myself set up here, sharing my screen, pull up my notes. Let me see if I can get this chat open. Okay, here we go. All right. Well, hello all. My name is Maddie Eberly. I am the low impact forestry specialist here at MOFGA. I'm a forester and a botanist by training. And part of my job here at MOFGA is to steward our woodlot, which extends across 150 acres in Unity and Thorndike. All right, so I'd like to start with a brief history, and Emily certainly did a good job of, kind of touching on some of these things as well. But the land we now call Maine was covered by the Laurentide ice sheet well over 10,000 years ago. The land where we are now would have been under 1.5 miles of ice. So as the glacier receded, it carved to the landscape with erosion and sediment deposits. The relief of that pressure allowed the land to rise, which caused the ocean to recede. So wildlife, and this is including plants and fungi, began to reappear on the landscape. From studying sediment cores, we know that the first tree to appear was likely a spruce, safely growing nearby in what we call a refugia, or an area that wasn't covered by the ice. The ancestors of the Wabanaki peoples came to the landscape and lived here and stewarded the land for millennia. But not too long ago, Europeans arrived and colonized this land, which caused great harm to the Wabanaki people, but also to the landscape. The land was majorly deforested for agricultural and political purposes. The massive white pines were favored for ship masts and were claimed by the crown. Today, we still refer to these large trees as king pines. And timber barons at the time were the large landowners, which has since transitioned over more to small land ownership. Though I will say the industrial forestry companies still hold cultural and political influence. Today, the landscape is dominated by small land ownership. With reforestation, the state of Maine is now about 90% forested, but there are very few areas of old growth forests that exist. In forest practices within the greater northeastern region, we rely heavily upon the natural regeneration of our forests following timber harvests. And with anthropogenic or human-induced climate change alongside continually introduced forest pests and diseases, continued commercial pressures, forest fragmentation and development, we are worried about the health and sustainability of our forests. Who wouldn't be? So kind of going on from that, what is climate change? We can see the signs of climate change in the weather. We are and will experience increased periods of intense heat, heavy rain, periods of drought, uncertain snow cover, irregular temperature fluctuations, and more intense storms. All of these factors lead to stressed trees that can't get enough water or stay cool, have soggy feet when they'd rather be dry, become susceptible to intense freezes without snow for insulation, and are becoming more likely to blow over or split with all those intense storms we're having. So while our trees are stressed by the weather patterns, they also have to navigate the hardship of pests and diseases. So we have plenty of native pests and diseases that our trees are able to sustain through low and high fluctuations. However, we also have introduced pests and disease that our trees have not adapted or evolved to resist. So a tree can sustain losing leaves or having their bark damaged when they have time to recover. But with the persistent infections, a tree is more likely to succumb to the disease or the pest, and especially if it's already stressed by these climatic conditions. Okay, but wait, there's hope. So managing a forested landscape can be overwhelming with the number of hardships our forests face, but there's always hope, and our forests will persist regardless of our actions. They just are going to look different than what we're used to. So the secret tool our forests have is diversity. With more species, age, size, and genetic diversity there is, the healthier and more resilient our forests are. For example, when emerald ash borer is more common throughout Maine, it's going to kill very many ash trees. However, not every species of ash is as susceptible as the next to the borer, and the borer prefers large trees over small trees, and it doesn't bother the seeds, which allow new ash trees to grow. The mature ash will disappear, but as long as there are other species, we still have a forest. There is some species specificity that cannot be recovered, and cultural importances too, but the habitat and landscape as a whole can persist. From studies that have been done, we do have a decent idea of what might happen to our landscape. One study that is worth checking out that I'll share here in the chat as well is the New England and Northern New York Forest Ecosystem Vulnerability Assessment and Synthesis. So if you can survive the title and the 246 pages that follow, you'll learn a great deal. But basically, the species ranges are shifting, and some will expand, some will contract, and based on all this is based on their preferred environmental conditions. This change is happening faster than our tree species naturally migrate. So something we might consider is, in response to this climate change, is assisted migration. So essentially, assisted migration is taking trees from a little bit south and moving them a little bit north. There are different types of assisted migration. We can seek to move a whole population. We can seek to expand the range. Or we could jump a spatial gap and plant southern species or genetics further north. And when I say genetics, what I mean is we take a tree that is currently here in Maine at its northern extent of its range and seek out seeds from its southern extent, which is outside of Maine, and take those seeds and plant them further north here in Maine, so that they have those genetic adaptations to a warmer climate, in hopes of building the genetic resilience here, as well as the diversity of the species within its northern range. So we will be planting these trees with the anticipation that as they mature and begin to produce seeds themselves, the climate will be ideal for them to succeed and for those seeds to grow into trees and kind of continue the hopes and intents of the success of the species. So this is an intense thing to look at, don't worry. But it's a great resource to pick out which tree will do well here in Maine. So I'm going to drop another link in the chat here. So this is the Climate Change Atlas for tree species. This resource tells you how much of a tree is present, as well as how we might anticipate the species responding to climate change. So you can go in on that website and pick out Maine as the state, and it gives you this multi-page printout of what we can expect to see. It's not a sure thing. Everything in science is waiting to be disproven, is one of my favorite things from one of my college professors. But you know, it gives us a good idea. Here at MOFGA, we planted 28 trees and shrubs in our woodlot as part of an assisted migration project. So species we planted include sassafras, white oak, tulip poplar, eastern ninebark, redbud, spicebush, pawpaw, white oak, sweet gum, black oak, and hackberry. And many of those species are planted multiply. And I will say visitors are always welcome. So here are just some of those trees along with one of our volunteers who helped us plant. And I saw some folks on the call who helped us plant as well. So your trees are doing well, I promise. We do have to see if they survive the winter though. That is one of the challenges of assisted migration. So one thing I like to emphasize within, the woods and areas with trees is just human safety. So with human safety as a priority, there are some things to consider when you're planting trees or working in the woods. Some species may be more susceptible to diseases and pests or have a shorter lifespan. So it's important to do your research on the trees that you're planting. Or that are existing already. So brown-tailed moths cause nasty rashes and favor trees such as oaks and apples and cherries and birch. While we want these tree species to be present in the landscape, it might be something to consider for where you're planting those trees or where you're building paths to wander. So some of our native plants like poison ivy and poison sumac can cause rashes as well, and should be on the radar for anyone working in the woods. Our risk of fire is only increasing with climate change, so making your home fire resilient is an important consideration. Thick brush, resinous plants, not ideal close to a home. And another important consideration is allergies. If you're particularly susceptible to tree pollen, be sure to know what triggers the reaction before planting a potentially irritating tree. So how do you choose a tree? Some things to consider when you're planting your tree in or near your garden would be as follows. So how much sunlight will the tree receive? What type of soil will the tree grow in? How much water will be available to the tree? What pests and diseases are nearby or will soon arrive? What other trees are growing around you? Do you have any particular needs from the tree? Are there any specific risks you'd like to mitigate? So I don't have the answers to all these questions, but talking to your local, nursery specialist is definitely going to help guide you along. But I will say I'm happy to chat if you do want to send out an email with a question. So yeah, plant species that are already nearby or ones that will soon be here, and just kind of reflect your surrounding landscape within that. So another great resource that I'll share here too is the Maine Forest Service's guidebook, Forest Trees of Maine. So this has really great overviews of species that are currently here in Maine. Emily did a really great job of just kind of talking about like how, native is a very subjective word, and so is invasive. So as I'm going here, just kind of keep that in mind. Um, so not all non-native species are invasive, and some native plants we might consider to be invasive, such as poison ivy, are not actually classified as such. Why we don't necessarily want invasive species in our forests includes the ability of them to leave out early, propagate easily, and kind of shift an ecosystem. So a high density of invasive species tends to lead to decreased biodiversity and therefore decreased forest resiliency. So examples of plants that we title as invasive would be shrubby honeysuckle, barberry, knotweed, and many, many more plants. If you want more resources on what these plants are, I'd recommend looking at the Maine Natural Area Program's website, and they have more information about all these plants. So climate change can be overwhelming, especially when we have to make decisions. Just remember to take it one day at a time. Pictured here is my father, Harold, who is pictured with a massive white pine that we might refer to as a king pine. And I attributed that quote to him because he says it to me often, but I guess you likely already know the quote. So with that, thank you for listening, and I will pass on to the next.
Thanks, Maddie. Erin, you are good to share your screen when you're ready.
Thank you. Uh, just looking for it. Okay, can you see that title slide? All right, excellent. So my name is Aaron Parker. I run Edgewood Nursery in Falmouth, where I sell lots of different plants. I often focus on um, unusual edibles, medicinal plants, and local ecotype native plants. And today I'm going to be talking about ornamentals for a changing climate. If I can get my slides. Oh, there we go, to advance. All right. Other presenters have covered this pretty well, but we're looking at longer, hotter seasons, more drought, more flood, less reliable snow cover. And one thing that hasn't really been touched on yet is polar vortex destabilization, which has brought us some really intense cold snaps. And one of the questions that we received before the beginning of the presentation was, hey, can I plant zone 6 and 7 plants now? And the answer is no. And that has a lot to do with that polar vortex destabilization. So even though we are overall having already experiencing a significantly warmer climate, and we're going to continue to move in that direction, we're still getting these extreme cold weather events when that Arctic air kind of moves down into our area. So as much as we want to be planting plants that have the capacity to withstand real intense heat and drought, and also intense rain and flood events, we we don't want to look too far south because we want those plants to be able to survive the winter also. Just some broad strategies for adaptive gardening in a climate change scenario, utilizing hardy and adaptable perennials and woody plants. They tend to withstand the irregularities of our changing climate a lot better than annuals. And especially when we're talking about ornamentals, ornamental gardening has often favored annuals because they have such long bloom periods. But some of the other speakers have mentioned the importance of high biodiversity and utilizing native plants. So those ideas can kind of come together to fill in a garden with color and ornamental elements that can also withstand climate change. Another strategy is heavy mulch. And someone else mentioned leaving leaves. I utilize both leaves and wood chips as mulch strategies. And just using a lot of that material, or even just leaving it where it falls, helps in several ways. It moderates the soil temperature a lot, so that intense heat that we're starting to get more and more of in the summer can really damage soils, and having a good mulch layer helps with that. It also helps to build soil carbon, which allows the soil to store a lot more of the rain, which both mediates the drought and flood conditions that we're experiencing more of. You may want to consider swales or ditches if they're suitable to your landscape, and that those types of, small earthworks can actually make a pretty significant change in how water moves across your landscape, and that can help you keep water draining into the soil where that's beneficial, and help move it away where you want that. And then especially to help with the heat of summer. Shade trees are really important. Um, and I think that was covered quite well by others. When we're talking more specifically about ornamentals, um, tulip poplar is a really nice tree. Not quite native up here, but a near native and has a lot of ornamental properties. Sourwood, Oxydendrum arboretum, is another ornamental tree to consider. They're a little bit slow growing, but the fall color and the blooms are pretty spectacular. All right, I'm gonna give some example plants. Switchgrass, Panicum virgatum, tolerates both drought and flood. It has really nice three-season interest. So in the spring and summer, you get glossy foliage, and that foliage tends to stick around through the winter. So you've got something in the garden through that time period. It's native and its range goes well into the south, so it's not only well adapted here, but will probably continue to be quite well adapted into climate change scenarios. And does well in sun or part shade, and can get quite large, up to 6, maybe even more feet tall, especially if it's got some good soil fertility. White snake root. This is one of the most adaptable native plants around, tolerates both drought and flood, and I've got it in several areas in my garden, and in a rich soil area in full sun. It's like 5 or 6 feet tall, very, covered in blooms that attract lots of butterflies and other insects. And it's also seeded into my gravel driveway. So in like the worst possible soil conditions in full shade, and it's still blooming, but it's like, 12 inches tall. So very adaptable. Um, Also deer resistant. That can be an issue for a lot of places. Um, Potential downside, they do tend to self-sow. So if you've got a lot of open soil, or you just don't want this one spreading around too much, you can always deadhead it before those seeds blow away. Spotted bee balm. This one's near native. I think our closest wild populations are like Vermont-ish. But this is a really nice one for areas that get kind of fried in the heat of summer. I've got the back of my land backs up to an abandoned sand pit, and this is growing out of pure gravel that's like 50 feet deep, like the worst hot, dry conditions. And even when we had a pretty historic drought a few years ago, this plant was still blooming and was absolutely loaded with pollinators, because everything else was just like crispy and couldn't produce nectar in those really harsh conditions. So spotted bee balm is really lovely for that. Um, Also deer resistant, also a really nice culinary herb. Kind of tastes like halfway between oregano and basil. Makes a great infused vinegar, and it really has, provides a lot, easy to grow. Um, Kind of a weird life cycle. It's a short-lived perennial. So they do sometimes die back a lot. And I always like to encourage people to leave the stems up so that the plant can self-sow. So even if you have a plant that dies after a few years, it will likely have dropped enough seed that it'll come back on its own. I think this is the only plant I'm going to talk about that's not at least almost native, but it's one of my favorite ornamentals in my garden. It's gas plant, Dictamnus albus, and it's actually pretty closely related to the citrus fruits, and it has a absolutely lovely citrus scent to the foliage. Um, Flowers are beautiful, attracts butterflies, and even once the flowers have gone by, the seed pods are like this deep red color, and the foliage is very um, dark green, glossy, makes a really nice cut flower. Just an all around great ornamental. Um, and all the other ones I've talked about are like pretty bomb proof right out the gate. This one does need a little bit of extra care for the first year or two to really get established, but after that, very heat and drought resistant. And another native that you don't see too much in gardens. This is beachhead iris, Iris hookeri, and it's endemic to eastern Maine and the Canadian Maritimes. Really highly ornamental, showy dwarf iris. They tend to be in the like 8 to 12-inch tall range, and they prefer moderate conditions but can tolerate both drought and flood. Some of our other native irises, like the blue flag iris, really like a wet spot. And beachhead iris is because they're adapted to grow in sandy conditions um, near the beach. They are nice that they have a little more flexibility for gardens and can take a flood when it floods and can take a drought when that rain doesn't come through, and really just a very beautiful flower for the ornamental garden. Common milkweed, I think, is kind of slept on as an ornamental. Um, has People are coming around to the idea that we should be planting this for monarch butterflies, which we should, but it also is beautiful. The scent of the flowers is just stunning. Um, and there's also other specialist insects that need this plant, not just monarchs. And it's also really lovely food for humans. I personally like the shoots the best, but the buds, flowers, and young pods are all edible. It does need to be thoroughly cooked. You don't need to boil it in multiple changes of water. Basically, just needs to be really hot all the way through. But you should um, be careful when preparing it, and only have a small taste the first time you eat it, just in case you're sensitive to that. But tolerates drought, deer, weak soil, um, and really the only downside is it does spread by rhizome, and I wouldn't want to pair that with delicate flowers in a flower garden, but I think it does deserve deserve a place in an ornamental landscape. I think that might. Oh, no. Thought that was my last slide. This is probably my last one. Um, for those really, really hot areas that will kill, most plants, I'm thinking edge of driveway, south side of buildings. Places like this can be hard to place resilient plants, but the eastern prickly pear has thrived through through the hottest, driest weather that I have observed. And near native, the nearest native populations are in southern New Hampshire, and these guys are fully winter hardy, and they don't even really need that extremely hot, dry um, uh, microclimate, but they handle it very well. They can grow basically anywhere with well-drained soil and full sun. And um, yeah, kind of fun to have a near native cactus in your garden here in Maine. So I think that is what I've got for you today, and we can move on to the Q&A. If I can figure out how to stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you also again, Emily and Maddie. We'll start opening it up to some questions that have already come in the chat, and you all are free to type any other questions that you have in the chat as they come to you. And after we kind of get through some of these initial ones, you're also welcome to ask questions by unmuting yourself. We love to hear your voices. So first question that came up is for Maddie. Someone was wondering where the assisted migration trees that MOFGA's been planting came from. Maybe if you can say both like their sort of traditional native region and like literally where you sourced them from.
Yeah, great question. So I was not employed by MOFGA at the time that the initial round of plants were sourced, so I can't say for sure where those trees were purchased from. They were bare root trees, so we did have a higher casualty rate, just because it's harder for bare root trees to be established than those with soil around them, and other factors that I'm only beginning to grow my knowledge in. But so the second planting we did was sourced from a local plant sale via our partner collaborator. So I don't have a good answer for where those trees specifically came from. But I can say that generally for assisted migration, it's good to know where things were grown, even though we didn't quite follow that ourselves. And having things that were from seed sources near the northern extent of their range might be able to do better in our climate because they have a slightly hardier genetic adaptation to that colder condition, whereas seeds from the more southern range, they do have great heat and drought adaptation, but the trees that are closer to the northern range will do better in Maine to begin with. And I'm trying to think. So generally, things that we planted out in the woodlot are near natives, as Erin was describing them, but some of them, like white oak, are already here in Maine, and we're nudging them a little bit farther north. So it's a little bit more of that population um, migration that we're doing in that case than necessarily the assisted migration where we're kind of jumping a bit of a gap. So, there's kind of a couple of different ways to look at it, but generally, trying to source things from your local nurseries is really great. Support local businesses. There's not really too much in the way of a large, overarching nursery that folks source specific for the assisted migration at this point. So, and I will say we did buy a bunch of pawpaws from Erin. So,
Cool. Thanks, Maddie. And yes, delicious pawpaws. Okay, and then we have a little question series geared toward Emily and Maddie. So if someone has shrubs, trees, or other plants in their garden that they want to get rid of and replace with something that looks like nicer and plants that that the grower would like to choose themselves, is this bad for the ecosystem and for climate change? Asker has some anxiety about destroying and interrupting the current environment there.
I can go first and I can pass it to you, Maddie. That's not good. Okay. Yeah, I mean, every time you dig up a plant or dig a hole, you have to think about, you have to weigh all of your options. I think Maddie brought up invasive species. So if it's an invasive species, it's probably best to remove it and replace it with something that is going to support biodiversity and going to fill a more holistic role in your land. But yeah, anytime you dig something up, you're releasing carbon, right? But a lot of it comes down to species, and I'll take Maddie's quote and say one day at a time. Anytime I look at removing or installing plants. I never try to do large expanses at once, and I always encourage people to start with small and do incremental movements. So if you have like a bunch of shrubs in your yard and you want to totally replace them all, start slow. That's both going to save you money, but it's also going to stop from anything too extreme happening at once. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I can add on a little bit. So when I think about conservation being a forester, I'm very focused at that landscape scale, rather than necessarily one specific species over another. Though it depends on everything in forestry, it depends. So thinking about if there's one plant that is, within its native range and you'd rather have a different plant that's within its native range, I'm guessing that those species are things that are common and nearby. So for things that are common, I wouldn't be too worried about that replacement of one species with another, and I wouldn't be worried about that large ecosystem harm that comes out of that, because if it's a common species, no harm done in that regard. Um, if it's something that's kind of rare or unusual, some species that, do need a little bit more of our human effort to keep it going on the landscape, maybe that's something to leave there, even if it's not the most sightly thing to see. So it just kind of, it's plant by plant, case by case. But I personally wouldn't worry about, the disruption to the ecosystem as a whole by making a decision like that. I think when I think about conservation, it's that ecosystem stability is what I'm after, rather than one little plant in the greater scheme of things.
Thank you both. And then a couple questions geared toward Erin, but welcome input from any of our panelists. So first question is with plants like switchgrass that grow tall, are they prone to ticks? And follow up, are ticks native pests or invasive? And do we have any recommendations among our panelists for how to avoid them without use of pesticides?
So I haven't noticed any increase in ticks with any of the plants that I mentioned. I believe there is actually a pretty strong correlation between tick populations and some of the invasives, like barberry, I think is and I'm seeing my other panelists like, yeah, that's right. So we're cutting down on some of those invasives might actually help the tick issue. I believe the ticks we're dealing with are native species, but their populations have kind of blown up recently, which is making them more of a problem for us as humans. Um, and I mean, I think a lot about ticks actually because I've had Lyme disease multiple times. Um, and I think the avoiding them is an important thing for gardeners to be thinking about. So I will talk about that for just a second. I think the most important thing is daily tick checks, like really examining yourself. And if you have someone who can like check the back of your neck and your back and stuff like that, where you can't easily see, just being in that habit is very protective. You did mention not using pesticides. I use a product called Lyme Ease, which is sort of kind of a pesticide in that it is permethrin infused fabric. And it's a gaiter, so it's kind of like a sock with no foot. And I pull my socks over the bottom of my pants, and then I put those on over. And it's a very minimal amount of pesticide, and it's a very targeted use that's not going into the environment at all. Um, and I find those to be extremely helpful in avoiding ticks. You still got to do your tick check all the time, but um, that is a useful way because I think no matter what the landscape is, you're gonna run into ticks if you're outside in most parts of Maine. So we can take into consideration, having permanent pathways that really helps to avoid too much interactions with ticks, but we should be expecting to interact with ticks. One other tick thing is if you do get a bad tick bite, um, one dose of doxycycline is indicated and greatly reduces your chances of contracting Lyme disease with pretty minimal side effects. So all these things are things to be kind of carefully considering, and we we basically have to learn to live with ticks and kind of adapt to their presence.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. Just kind of what Aaron said, invasive species are often associated with ticks, but the reason that they are is because often they're thorny, unpleasant things for us to pull and work with. And so that's really great habitat for small mammals to hide in and build their nests in. And those are often carriers of ticks. So if you have good small mammal population habitat, or a good deer habitat, those are often going to be cases where you will be seeing more ticks. Ticks really like moist environments to raise their young in. Well, not actively raising their young, but they raise their young in moist environments. So if you're able to, like take away some of that shade, which isn't always the best thing, but maybe you want to do that anyways if the tree's leaning near your house, call an arborist, but yeah, just kind of creating a little bit more airflow, a little more sunlight, drying out an area, that'll help reduce the tick population. For land management, sometimes prescribed fire is used as well. Like Emily was saying with the land near where she's living, there used to be a lot more of that active fire management, which is really helpful to keep tick populations down. Um, and I feel like I had one more point, but I'm just going to be quiet because I can't remember right now. So
I'll just add one really quick more thing. Fully agree with what everything Maddie and Aaron have said. There's there's a lot of products out there that are pesticides, or pesticides for ticks, and there are certain ones. I mean, I would say avoid any pesticides besides the clothes treatment. Be aware of those because they are super toxic. We were just talking about that, super toxic to cats. So don't let permethrin around your cats. It's really not good for them. And then they sell, I just always want to do a PSA. They sell these tick tube things that are supposed to be like, they end up in a mouse hole, and it basically puts permethrin on the mice, and then they end up killing all these ticks that are the ones that are spreading Lyme disease. So they've been really pushed in the pesticide industry as like, these are the ones that are going to stop the Lyme disease ticks. But those are also what bumblebees use for their homes. And there's like very quick studies that show that these tick tubes are causing like massive deaths of bumblebees that nest in old mouse holes. So definitely don't use those for our little bumblebees. That's all. Everything else, yeah.
Thanks, everyone. And a good also recommendation from Kristen in the chat that you could get yourself a flock of guinea hens. Some of our poultry do eat ticks.
Warn your neighbors first, though. They're super loud.
Great point. Um, and another question for you. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about how swales and culverts can help garden landscape and what considerations one should take into account when including them in their garden or land?
Sure. Kind of a big topic, but generally, when trying to keep water on the landscape to mitigate drought or reduce the need for irrigation. People tend to think of swales on contour. So if you imagine a topographical map of your garden, those contour lines would be where you would make a swale, which is essentially a ditch. And the idea is you want to slow down the movement of water. So as it runs across the soil surface, you want it to kind of puddle in a place where it can sink into the ground and be kind of stored there. Um, and that might be very helpful. Like I've tried to utilize that with moderate success on my land because I live in an old gravel pit, and every drop of rain that falls here, I want to sink into the soil as much as possible. If your soil profile is very different though, and you have too much moisture accumulating and areas that flood, you might consider kind of the opposite, which is a ditch that might cut across some contours or kind of wind around contours to help move water um, away from an area to prevent flooding. Um, and it's kind of it's very important to observe carefully before implementing either of these things so that you don't accidentally send water where you don't want it to go. Certainly don't want water being sent towards your home or other buildings that might be damaged by it. Um, and it's and even pretty small changes can make significant differences. So I like to encourage people to watch very carefully when the snow is melting and see where water is moving, where it puddles, and also go out in a heavy rainstorm and see how water is moving across the landscape and how you might um, modify that a little bit. So especially like if you're, you know, if you get a temporary river moving through your garden or your landscape whenever it rains, maybe you can slow that up in certain areas where you want water to infiltrate. Or if you have giant puddles that form, maybe it needs a little ditch to allow that water to move to a different area. So, yeah, just kind of observe carefully when water's moving and see what minor tweaks you can make to help it go where you would like it to go.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, and then we have an asker who appreciated the info on polar vortex behavior and asks what reference resources you all have or what you use regularly in order to keep up with climate change weather as as things change.
I don't have anything that I'd regularly use. I'm just kind of watching, so I'll pass it to the other panelists.
Yeah, I'll say I don't necessarily have a specific resource that I'm following because I find that those things tend to shift. And you know, yeah, no resource stays the same forever. Um, so basically, just kind of, I tend to tune into different listservs, so emails that have kind of synopsis of research that's been happening, or, events like these where I can go and learn something new. That's kind of what I try to do is tune in with those different organizations that have things going on so that I can be as informed as I can be, especially in this role where I talk to people a lot. So
Yeah, same with me. There's not I haven't found any good like consistent like website or anything that's regularly updating any new advice. One thing that I'll note, just not necessarily on climate, but as we're keeping track of weather, if you're thinking about, plants, like I'm sure all of us who are, trying to plant this spring are constantly checking the weather. I always cross-reference several different weather sites and apps, and I always look at radar and like the pressure and temperature systems, because sometimes what I'm seeing when they're saying like this is the expectations for pressure and temperature, like what I get out of it is different from whatever's like written in the little paragraph of this is what to expect for the week. So just like compiling your data in those sites is useful to get kind of a better picture, because a lot of people, get mad at weather reports because they didn't say the right thing, but you can kind of get a more accurate read by combining a bunch of them.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And I'll also just for our audience, I'll put in the chat this website to Climate Reanalyzer, which I will say, like, I don't think for the layperson is super easy to navigate, but like, for the asker and for anyone who's interested in getting like nerdy about models and predictions, this website is developed by the Maine State climatologist Sean Burkell, and it is updated regularly. But again, it's not, I think, the most user-friendly to the layperson. So just wanted to share it in case it's user-friendly to you. And we have another question. I think for everybody. So how beneficial would it be to also consider and utilize fungi and mycelium in your planting plans? How would they fare in the scheme of climate change, carbon sequestration, droughts, etc.?
I could start. Anybody else can feel free to chime in. There's a couple like levels of question within that question, I think. Someone can say more than me about food. I think like if you have the ability to add fungi to your yard habitat, whatever you're building, that's great. You know, it's part of the food web. The more it just adds into that species diversity. It's also, as you manage your yard for a more productive habitat, you will start seeing more fungus show up because you're going to be leaving things like dead branches or stems, snag trees. Snag trees is the term for a tree that's dead and still standing, and that is some of the most prime habitat for nesting species, for fungal growth, for things like that. So really, as you're, you know, managing your land or allowing it to live through the natural environmental processes, you're going to start seeing a lot of fungus show up, which is really cool and adds a lot of dynamic excitement to your yard as well. If you want to start adding edible funguses, there are like plenty of places where you can get spores and add them in, and that's always fun to do. And then I get this question a lot about specifically adding mycorrhizae to your fungus when you're growing plants, or to your soil when you're growing plants. It's like a common thing now, like all this bagged soil has mycorrhizae added to it. And I just want to note that that's usually, you know, just a selling point. Most of the time that mycorrhizae is long dead by the time it gets added to the soil. And then when it's sitting in a bag at a, you know, garden warehouse for a while, it's like definitely dead. So it's really not gonna, everything that I've read so far on that is that it's not really adding anything special to it. It's just kind of getting people to buy it because they found out that mycorrhizae is so important to, you know, our living ecosystems, that folks started adding it to soils, and that's not really gonna help.
I'll add to that. Basically, my opinion on this is fungi and mycorrhizae are extremely important, but they need not much input from us. Like, we don't need to put them there; they're already there, and appropriate fungi will colonize your garden and your mulch and all that stuff with no input from you. If you want edible mushrooms, that you know, you can specifically add those, but basically they just need us to not fuck up their habitat. So like having lots of dead carbonaceous plant material around and on the ground is all we really need to do for those fungi to do their thing.
Yeah, I'll chime in here and just, you know, reiterate what our other panelists here have said. But yeah, you know, fungi is essential to our ecosystem function. It's partly how, you know, our fallen deadwood trees and branches decompose, and you know, it's critical to have fungi in the landscape, but most of it is going to colonize well on its own. There are some plants that, you know, have mutual relationships with specific fungi. And so, you know, there's some things that you might have a hard time starting from seed if that fungus isn't present in your soil already. How do you add that fungus into your soil? I couldn't tell you. But but you know, it's there are special relationships that do occur, and mycorrhizae in relationship to trees is kind of an extension of their root network. So it helps them access more resources, and you know, There's a really great book that came out recently called The Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard that I'm sure many folks are familiar with. And it goes into that a little bit. But as a general note, it's species specific. So every species of tree is going to have a different relationship to that. So
One other thing that I will mention is there are some specific cases where the appropriate mycorrhizae might not be present, which is especially relevant to the Ericaceae family. And while commercial inoculants do exist for these, I prefer to utilize a technique that the author Michael Phillips calls ent soil, which basically means like when you're planting um, a plant in this family, if it's going into an area where there have been no Ericaceae growing and you think it might need a little help getting its um, fungal symbiont, you would go to a spot nearby, hopefully, where that family is thriving and just take a little handful of soil from underneath a mature plant that's doing well and add it to your planting hole to try and introduce those fungi to a new spot.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I've had better luck by taking a little bit of the soil. It's just really important to note anytime you're collecting seed from the wild or soil from the wild, make sure you have those permissions and your populations are high enough and you're not stealing from anybody. By anybody, I mean plants.
Well, thanks all. That is the end of the questions we have in the chat so far. If anyone wants to pop some more in there or unmute and verbalize a question, we're happy to hear from you.
I'm going to throw a few resources in about it's kind of host plant insect related. See if it'll send.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions popping up, so I think we've accomplished what folks needed from you all tonight. So thank you so much, or this afternoon, I guess. Thank you so much, Emily, Maddie, and Erin for your presentations, and thanks to everyone who joined. You'll all get a recording of the presentation and the resources that were shared within a few days. Yeah, great talking with everyone.
Thank you, Maddie W, for hosting, and appreciate hearing from the other panelists as well. And great presentations.
I second.
Third.
Have a good
Full
evening.
motion, meeting adjourned, right?
Right.
Okay.
Bye,
Take care.